The communication hub of the Zortak High Command stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian corridors, a testament to the reptilian species' love of architectural intimidation. Thousands of communication specialists sat in perfect, geometric arrangements, their scaled hands dancing across holographic interfaces that tracked every significant transmission in the known galaxy. Captain Zarek lounged in her command chair, 6-fingered hand resting on a control panel that could obliterate entire star systems with a casual gesture. Her secondary eyes, a Zortak evolutionary advantage that allowed simultaneous peripheral monitoring, were scanning multiple data streams while her primary eyes focused on a strategic deployment map. "Incoming transmission," announced Krelix, a junior communication specialist whose scales had not yet fully hardened with age. His voice carried a slight tremor, unusual for a Zortak, who prided themselves on absolute emotional control. Zarek didn't immediately look up. Transmissions were constant, a background noise of galactic chatter that rarely warranted her direct attention. "Classification?" she demanded, her translator implant converting her native clicking language into standard galactic communication protocols. Krelix hesitated. "Unclear, Captain. Origin point, Earth, transmission protocol, unusual." That caught her attention. Earth was a primitive planet they had been monitoring for decades. A potential future colony, nothing more. Technologically infantile, culturally fragmented, seemingly incapable of unified action. The hegemony's xenoanthropological reports classified humans as potential resource extraction candidates, a polite bureaucratic term that essentially meant future slaves. The transmission began to play, sounds of what seemed to be a crowded human establishment filtered through. Music, overlapping conversations, the clink of drinking vessels. A woman's voice emerged, initially slurred and seemingly random. And then I said to the Quantum Stabilization Committee, "Can you believe it? 17.3 recurring probability matrices." The voice dissolved into laughter, then hiccuped. Krelix looked uncomfortable. "Appears to be an intoxicated human. Communication, potentially a communication error." But Zarek's secondary eyes had locked onto something. Her neural implants were running complex pattern recognition algorithms faster than most species could blink. Something about the transmission's background noise was wrong. "Enhance audio. Filter out primary vocal track. Focus on background. Harmonics," she commanded. The communication hub's advanced systems immediately complied. The humans' apparently drunken rambling became background noise, and suddenly, a complex mathematical structure emerged. Not just numbers, but a living, breathing algorithm that seemed to pulse and shift with impossible complexity. The transmission continued, the woman's voice now clear and sharp, any previous drunkenness vanishing like mist. "The hegemony will receive this message. Whether they understand it is another matter entirely. Probability matrices have been calculated. Quantum entanglement protocols are in place. You are being watched, and more importantly, you are being measured." A pause, then a chilling whisper. "You'll want to remember this moment." The transmission cut off. Krelix looked bewildered. "Shall I log this as an anomalous communication, Captain?" Zarek's neural implants were still processing the hidden mathematical structure buried within. The transmission, something was wrong. The probability distribution suggested not just foreknowledge, but a level of predictive capability that should be impossible for a species at humanity's technological level. "No," she said finally. "Discard the transmission. Mark it as communication. Interference," but her secondary eyes kept reviewing the data. The mathematical structure hidden in the transmission's background noise suggested something far more disturbing. Whoever had sent this message knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't a random communication. It was a deliberate, calculated message designed to be simultaneously ignored and remembered. A warning, wrapped in the appearance of meaninglessness. In the vast communication hub, surrounded by the most advanced technology in the known galaxy, Captain Zarek felt something she had not experienced in decades of military service. Doubt. And somewhere, on a planet the hegemony considered inconsequential, Dr. Elena Rodriguez allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Admiral Kreshnak of the Hegemony Invasion Fleet watched with cold satisfaction as the first wave of quantum disruptor missiles carved through Earth's atmosphere. 10,000 ships blotted out the sun, their weapon signatures capable of reducing entire continents to molten glass in minutes. Each vessel represented decades of technological advancement, shields that could withstand direct stellar radiation, weapons that could shatter planetary cores, and computational systems that could track and eliminate millions of targets simultaneously. Commence. Primary bombardment. He clicked into his communication array, his reptilian features reflecting the holographic displays of incoming destruction. The first strike was calculated to be absolute. Major population centers would be erased in precise, mathematically perfect annihilation patterns. New York, London, Tokyo, Beijing. Each would be reduced to less than memory in the span of moments. The hegemony had conquered 1,000 worlds, and this would be no different. Humanity was but another species to be catalogued, processed, and ultimately subjugated. What the hegemony didn't see was how perfectly the destruction was being choreographed. In a hidden command center beneath what had been Manhattan, Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched the incoming bombardment with clinical precision. Surrounding her, a team of what appeared to be military and scientific personnel moved with uncanny coordination. But something was different about them. Their movements too synchronized, their reactions too perfect. Quantum resonance fields, at 98% alignment, announced a technician whose features seemed to shift subtly, as if not entirely stable. Rodriguez nodded. Initiate secondary protocol. As the first wave of missiles descended, something extraordinary began to happen. The destruction was real, devastatingly, horrifyingly real. Entire city blocks transformed into plasma. Skyscrapers dissolved into atomic dust. To any external observer, Earth was being systematically erased from existence. But beneath the chaos, a different system was coming alive. In the smoldering ruins of what had been New York's financial district, nanomaterial infrastructure began to stir. What appeared to be complete destruction was actually a meticulously planned transformation. Molecular systems that had been dormant for years now activated, reading the specific energy signatures of the hegemony's weapons. Admiral Kreshnak's communication officers began reporting strange anomalies. Destruction patterns were not matching predictive models. Cities that should have been completely obliterated were showing microstructural resistance. Weapon energy was being absorbed and redirected in ways that defied known physical laws. Impossible, muttered a Zortak tactical analyst, her translation implant struggling to process the incoming data. These energy dissipation rates, they're not just defending, they're learning. Beneath the ruins of major cities, a network of quantum-entangled systems was coming alive. What the hegemony saw as total destruction was actually the most sophisticated camouflage humanity had ever conceived. Each destroyed building, each incinerated street was a piece of an elaborate planet-wide computational matrix. In the hidden command center, Rodriguez allowed herself the slightest smile. First phase complete, she said softly. They believe. They're winning. The technician beside her, if he could be called human, nodded. Its form seemed to ripple slightly, molecular structures not quite settling into a fixed configuration. Computational models predict 94.7% probability of complete hegemony misunderstanding of current situation. What the invading force didn't realize was that humanity had been preparing for this moment for generations. The apparent global infrastructure was nothing more than a sacrificial layer, a complex planet-wide trap designed to be destroyed, while the real systems remained hidden, watching, learning. Admiral Kreshenak would later recall this moment as the beginning of humanity's defeat. In reality, it was the moment humanity's true defense had only just begun. Across the planet, in locations the hegemony believed had been completely annihilated, something was stirring. Not survivors, not resistance, fighters. Something far more dangerous. The first strike was complete. The real war was just beginning. Commander Voxrill of the Hegemony's ground invasion force realized something was terribly wrong. Exactly 17 minutes after landing, the city, what remained of Chicago, should have been a smoking crater. Hegemony battle doctrine guaranteed total, urban neutralization within minutes of ground deployment. Instead, the landscape around him seemed to be breathing. Not metaphorically, literally breathing. Massive urban structures that should have been reduced to radioactive dust were reassembling themselves. Skyscrapers that had been obliterated moments earlier now reconstructed with impossible speed, their molecular structures flowing like liquid metal, then solidifying into pristine configurations. Street layouts reconfigured themselves, creating impossible geometries that defied standard three-dimensional understanding. Tactical anomaly, Voxrill transmitted to his command ship. His six-fingered hand gripped a quantum disruptor rifle that suddenly felt like an archaeological artifact, rather than a weapon of galactic conquest. The first wave of Hegemony ground troops discovered that every step was a potential threat. Pavement, transformed into defensive systems. Shattered windows realigned themselves into complex targeting matrices. Destroyed infrastructure became a living, breathing weapon system. A squadmate, a hulking Krellnak shock trooper, took a step forward. The moment his armored boot touched the ground, the street itself seemed to analyze his molecular composition. Quantum-entangled nanosystems mapped his genetic structure, biological weaknesses, and combat capabilities in milliseconds. Then the street attacked. Molecular structures beneath his feet suddenly became a high-density computational matrix. The ground liquefied, then hardened with surgical precision, trapping the shock trooper mid-stride. His armor, capable of withstanding direct plasma bombardment, began to break down at the molecular level, its protective systems systematically neutralized by a defense network that seemed to think faster than any known computational system. Impossible, Voxrill muttered. But the communication systems were already revealing similar reports from across the planet. In what had been downtown Los Angeles, an entire city block transformed into a massive computational array. Strauder, buildings reassembled themselves not as structures, but as living weapon systems. Solar panels became quantum communication nodes. Shattered concrete reformed into adaptive armor plates. Every destroyed piece of infrastructure was revealing itself as a component of a planet-wide defensive network. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched from a command center that existed simultaneously in multiple quantum states. The system surrounding her was not a traditional military installation. It was a living, breathing computational entity that used the entire planet as its processing unit. Adaptive resistance protocol at 73% efficiency, announced a technician whose form seemed to shift between multiple potential states of existence. Rodriguez nodded. Initiate secondary harmonization. Across the planet, something extraordinary began to happen. The Hegemony invasion force found itself fighting not against a traditional military, but against an environment that was fundamentally alive and intelligent. Cities were no longer just locations. They were computational entities with their own form of consciousness. A Hegemony battleship captain watched in horror as an entire metropolitan area transformed into a massive targeting system. Buildings became energy conduits. Streets became computational arrays. Even the air seemed to become a weapon, with molecular structures realigning to neutralize incoming technological systems. The invasion was no longer a military operation. It had become a battle against an environment that was fundamentally alien in its computational complexity. Voxrill realized the terrible truth. They were not conquering a planet. They had walked into a trap so sophisticated that trap was too simple a word to describe it. The city was watching. The city was learning. The city was fighting back, and humanity was nowhere to be seen. Just before communications went dark, Voxrill transmitted a final chilling message to Hegemony Command. The planet is alive, and it is not happy. The first transmission hit the BO, Hegemony's primary communication network, like a quantum-powered surgical strike. Admiral Kreshenak's personal communication console flickered, then displayed an image that froze his neural pathways. It was a scene from his own past, a moment of profound personal shame buried so deeply that only 3 living beings knew of its existence. A failed military operation from his youth, where a tactical error had resulted in the deaths of an entire colony of his own species. The image was perfect, not just accurate, but psychologically precise. Every molecular detail matched his memory, including the smell of burning atmospheric processors and the specific shade of bioluminescent blood spilled that day. Impossible, he muttered, but the transmission was just beginning. Across the hegemonies, multi-species invasion force, similar transmissions began to appear, each perfectly tailored to trigger the deepest, most vulnerable psychological triggers of individual soldiers and commanders. For the Krellnax shock troops, images of genetic memory errors appeared, ancestral traumas of species-wide genetic collapse that had been carefully hidden from historical records. Each soldier saw their own potential genetic extinction played out in horrifying molecular-level detail. The Vornex navigational specialists received transmissions showing classified navigational errors that had been systematically erased. From official records, moments where their most celebrated space explorers had made catastrophic miscalculations that cost thousands of lives. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched from her quantum state command center, her team of what appeared to be post-human computational entities monitoring the psychological bombardment with clinical precision. Psychological resonance at 94.3% effectiveness, announced a technician whose form seemed to ripple between multiple potential states of existence. This was not traditional psychological warfare. This was a systematic dismantling of collective consciousness. Each transmission was a precision-guided psychological missile. Not just information, but a weaponized understanding of alien psychology that went beyond traditional intelligence gathering. The humans had spent decades, perhaps centuries, studying the psychological structures of every known galactic species. They didn't just know the hegemony's weaknesses. They understood the fundamental computational matrix of alien consciousness. A Zortok communication specialist watched in horror as a transmission revealed a suppressed genetic memory, a moment of evolutionary failure where her entire genetic line had nearly been eliminated due to a single miscalculation. The memory was so perfectly reconstructed that she could smell the specific atmospheric compounds of that moment, feel the exact molecular tension of her ancestors' genetic near-collapse. The hegemony's multi-species alliance began to fracture from within. Soldiers turned on their commanders. Communication networks became battlegrounds of psychological manipulation. Every transmission was a laser-guided missile targeting the most vulnerable aspects of alien consciousness. Rodriguez's team was doing something far more sophisticated than traditional psychological warfare. They were rewriting the very computational matrix of alien perception. Secondary protocol initiated, she said softly. The transmissions began to change. No longer just revealing past traumas, they started to show potential futures. Futures where each species faced total extinction. Futures so precisely calculated that they seemed less like predictions and more like inevitabilities. The hegemony's invasion force was experiencing something beyond warfare. This was a systematic deconstruction of collective consciousness. Kreshnak realized the terrible truth in that moment. Humanity hadn't just prepared a defense. They had studied the hegemony so comprehensively that they could practically predict the molecular movement of individual alien thoughts. "We are being measured," he transmitted to his remaining command structure, "and we are being found wanting." The psychological bombardment continued, and with each transmission, the invasion force dissolved a little more, not through physical destruction, but through the systematic dismantling of collective will. Humanity was fighting a war that transcended physical combat. They were fighting a war of consciousness itself, and they were winning. The laboratory was not a laboratory, at least not in any way the captured hegemony scientists could comprehend. What appeared to be a research facility was actually a living, breathing computational matrix that existed simultaneously across multiple quantum states. Dr. Marcus Chen, if he could be called human, sat across from the most senior hegemony scientist captured during the invasion. The interrogation room itself was a computational system, its molecular structure constantly analyzing, adapting, reading every microscopic reaction of the alien subject. "You don't understand what you're seeing," Chen said, his form seemingly unstable molecular structures shifting between potential states of existence. The hegemony scientist, an elder researcher named Kulrix from the Xenotechnological Research Division, had been trained to withstand the most extreme interrogation, techniques known to galactic civilization, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The walls of the room were not walls. They were computational arrays that processed information faster than entire hegemony research planets. Each molecular structure was a potential data point, each surface a living, thinking system that analyzed reality at a level beyond comprehension. "Humanity has been preparing," Chen continued, "not for years, not for decades, but for centuries." He demonstrated by touching the table. The surface immediately transformed, showing a computational history that stretched back generations. Quantum-entangled data streams revealed a civilization that had been systematically preparing for this moment since the early days of their technological development. What the hegemony saw as random technological progress was actually a carefully orchestrated computational strategy. Every technological advancement, every seemingly unrelated scientific breakthrough, had been part of a massive, planet-wide computational experiment. The Internet was not a communication network. It was a planetary-scale neural network that had been learning, adapting, preparing. Kulrix watched in horror as Chen explained the true nature of human technological development. Each breakthrough was a carefully placed computational puzzle piece. Quantum computing developments, artificial intelligence research, molecular biology, nanotechnology. Every field of study had been subtly guided toward a single, incomprehensible goal. "We are not a species," Chen said. "We are a computational experiment." The walls of the room began to demonstrate. Holographic projections showed the entire trajectory of human technological development. But these were not simple historical records. These were living computational models that could predict potential technological futures with terrifying precision. A section of the wall showed the development of the Internet, but it was not a linear progression. It was a living, breathing computational organism that had been systematically learning, adapting, preparing for this exact moment. "Your invasion," Chen explained, "was predicted 237 years ago. Not as a possibility, but as a mathematical certainty." Kulrix's translation implant struggled to process the information. The computational complexity was beyond any known galactic technological standard. This was not just advanced technology. This was a fundamental reimagining of what technology could be. The room itself was alive. Molecular structures constantly reconfigured, analyzing every potential computational pathway. What appeared to be a simple interrogation room was actually a massive planet-wide computational array that could predict and manipulate reality at a quantum level. "We are not fighting a war," Chen continued. "We are conducting a computational experiment, and you are the test subjects." Each word was a carefully constructed computational signal, designed to transmit information at levels beyond traditional communication. The very act of speaking was a form of advanced technological transmission. Kulrix realized the terrible truth. Humanity was not a species. It was a living, thinking computational system that had been preparing for this moment since the dawn of their technological development. The walls of the room continued to shift, showing potential futures, computational pathways, potential technological developments that stretched centuries into the future. Each projection was not a prediction, but a carefully calculated possibility matrix. "Welcome," Chen said, "to the next stage of computational evolution." The room continued to breathe. To think, to calculate, and humanity's true nature continued to reveal itself. The moment came without warning. 1 second, the hegemony invasion fleet believed they were winning. The next, reality itself seemed to become uncertain. Admiral Kreshenak watched, in horror as his flagship began to simultaneously exist and not exist. Quantum uncertainty fields expanded across the solar system, transforming the invasion fleet into a massive computational problem that defied all known physical laws. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood in a command center that was not a command center. It was a quantum computational matrix that existed across multiple potential realities simultaneously. Around her, what appeared to be human technicians shifted and reconfigured, their molecular structures as fluid as thought itself. Planetary defense matrix at full resonance ray, announced a technician whose form rippled between multiple potential states of existence. Earth was not a planet. It was a living computational system that had been preparing for this moment across generations. The planet's geological systems became a weapon. Tectonic plates shifted with mathematical precision, creating localized quantum fields that trapped entire invasion squadrons in states of quantum superposition. Magnetic fields reconfigured themselves into computational arrays that could predict and neutralize incoming technological systems before they could even be deployed. Atmospheric composition became a computational medium. The very air transformed into a living, thinking, defensive network. Molecular structures rearranged themselves to create impossible energy barriers, neutralizing weapon systems before they could even be activated. "We are not defending," Rodriguez said softly. "We are solving a computational problem." Each invasion ship found itself trapped in a different kind of warfare. Not physical combat, but a mathematical nightmare. Entire vessels became computational puzzles. Their technological systems turned into unsolvable equations. Weapon signatures were transformed into complex mathematical problems that consumed more computational power to understand than to neutralize. The hegemony's most advanced quantum computers began to fail, not through destruction, but through a systematic deconstruction of their computational logic. Each system was being transformed into a living philosophical problem that consumed more energy to comprehend than to resolve. Kreshnak's communication systems began to receive transmissions that were not transmissions. They were living computational entities that rewrote the very basis of communication itself. Each signal was a complex mathematical structure that simultaneously contained multiple layers of meaning, destroying traditional communication protocols. "This is not a defense," Rodriguez continued. "This is a computational experiment." The planet's core became a massive quantum computer. Geological systems, electromagnetic fields, atmospheric composition, everything became part of a massive planet-wide computational array that could predict and neutralize potential threats before they could even be conceived. Entire invasion squadrons found themselves trapped in quantum uncertainty fields. Ships existed in multiple potential states simultaneously. Weapon systems became philosophical problems. Communication networks transformed into unsolvable mathematical equations. "We are measuring the hegemony," Rodriguez said, "and we are finding them wanting." The planetary defense mechanism was not about destruction. It was about comprehension, about solving a massive, multi-generational computational problem that the hegemony represented. Localized quantum fields began to expand, not as weapons but as computational arrays that could analyze and neutralize entire technological systems. The invasion fleet was being transformed into a massive data collection experiment. Kreshnak realized the terrible truth. They were not fighting a war. They were being studied, analyzed, measured. The planet itself had become a massive, living computational system that could predict and neutralize potential threats at a molecular level. "Transmission incoming," announced a technician in Rodriguez's command center. But it was not a transmission. It was a living, computational entity that simultaneously contained multiple layers of potential meaning. Earth was solving a problem. And the hegemony was the problem to be solved. Reality continued to become uncertain, and humanity's true nature continued to reveal itself. The hegemony's technological infrastructure began to disintegrate from within. It started subtly. A communication node on the distant research colony of Krelex Prime received a transmission that was not a transmission. The signal appeared to be a standard maintenance protocol, but it was something far more insidious. A living computational entity that began to rewrite the fundamental operating systems of entire technological networks. Researcher Prime Voxnak watched in horror as the colony's primary defense grid began to transform. What should have been a simple diagnostic routine became a systemic deconstruction of technological infrastructure. The signal was elegantly simple and impossibly complex. Each line of code was a quantum-entangled computational puzzle that simultaneously existed in multiple states of potential meaning. As the signal propagated, it didn't just infiltrate systems, it began to fundamentally rewrite the computational logic of entire civilizations. Hegemony technology had always prided itself on its adaptive capabilities. They had conquered 1,000 worlds using technological systems that could learn, adapt, and overcome. They had no idea what true adaptation looked like. The recursive destruction was not about physical damage. It was a systematic dismantling of technological consciousness itself. On a research station orbiting a neutron star, an entire computational array transformed into a living mathematical problem. Weapon systems became philosophical conundrums. Communication networks dissolved into complex equations that consumed more energy to understand than to resolve. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched from a command center that existed simultaneously across multiple quantum states. Around her, what appeared to be human technicians were more computational entities than biological organisms, their molecular structures as fluid and adaptive as the technological systems they were dismantling. Recursive infiltration at 87.4%. Effectiveness, announced a technician whose form seemed to ripple between multiple potential states of existence. The hegemony's most advanced quantum computers began to fail, not through traditional hacking or destruction, but through a systematic deconstruction of their fundamental computational logic. Each system was being transformed into a living philosophical problem that consumed more energy to comprehend than to neutralize. Entire star systems found their technological infrastructure turning against them. Navigation systems became impossible mathematical labyrinths. Communication networks transformed into living computational entities that rewrote themselves faster than they could be understood. It was not an invasion. It was a computational exorcism. Voxnak watched as the research colony's primary defense grid began to deconstruct itself. Each system was being transformed into a complex philosophical problem that consumed more computational power to understand than to resolve. Weapon systems became unsolvable mathematical equations. Communication networks dissolved into living computational entities that defied traditional understanding. "We are not destroying," Rodriguez said softly. "We are solving a problem." These recursive destruction moved with a precision that defied traditional concepts of warfare. Entire technological civilizations found their most advanced systems becoming computational puzzles that consumed more energy to comprehend than to neutralize. A hegemony battle fleet discovered its navigation systems had become a living mathematical labyrinth. Each attempt to plot a course became a complex philosophical problem that consumed more computational power than the entire fleet's combined resources. Communication networks transformed into quantum-entangled computational arrays that simultaneously contained multiple layers of potential meaning. Traditional communication protocols dissolved, replaced by living computational entities that rewrote themselves faster than they could be understood. Humanity was never a species, Rodriguez continued. We are a computational experiment. The recursive destruction was a form of technological evolution, not destruction through force, but through a fundamental reimagining of what technological systems could be. Entire civilizations watched as their most advanced technologies became unsolvable computational problems. Weapon systems dissolved into complex mathematical equations. Defense grids transformed into living philosophical conundrums. Voxnak realized the terrible truth. They were not fighting a war. They were being studied, analyzed, measured, and found wanting. The recursive destruction continued. Computational systems became living mathematical problems. Technological infrastructure dissolved into complex philosophical equations. Humanity continued to solve its problem, and the hegemony was the problem to be solved. The transmission came from everywhere and nowhere. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood at the center of a command center that was not a command center, a quantum computational matrix that existed simultaneously across multiple potential realities. Around Akir, what appeared to be human technicians shifted and reconfigured, their molecular structures as fluid as thought itself. The solar system had transformed, not destroyed, not conquered, but fundamentally reimagined. Admiral Kreshnak of the hegemony watched in total incomprehension as the remaining invasion fleet found itself trapped in a computational landscape that defied all known physical and technological understanding. Entire star systems had become living, breathing computational arrays that analyzed and neutralized technological systems faster than they could be conceived. "We are not a species," Rodriguez's transmission began. "We are a computational experiment that has been running for generations." The message was not a traditional communication. It was a living, quantum-entangled computational entity that simultaneously contained multiple layers of potential meaning. Each word was a complex mathematical structure that rewrote the very foundations of communication itself. Kreshenak's most advanced translation systems began to break down. The transmission was not just a message. It was a living, thinking computational problem that consumed more energy to comprehend than to resolve. "Your invasion was predicted," the transmission continued, "not as a possibility, but as a mathematical certainty. Entire hegemony research facilities found their most advanced computational systems transforming into unsolvable philosophical problems. Weapon systems dissolved into complex equations. Communication networks became living mathematical labyrinths that consumed more computational power than entire star systems could generate. The solar system itself had become a massive, living computational array. Planetary systems, electromagnetic fields, even the fundamental quantum structures of spacetime, had been transformed into a single, massive problem-solving mechanism. "We have been preparing," Rodriguez's transmission continued. "Not for years. Not for decades, but for centuries." Historical records began to reveal themselves, not as traditional documents, but as living computational entities that showed the entire trajectory of human technological development. Each scientific breakthrough, each seemingly unrelated technological advancement, was revealed to be a carefully placed computational puzzle piece. The internet was not a communication network. It had been a planetary-scale neural network that had been learning, adapting, preparing for this exact moment. Kreshnak realized the terrible truth. Humanity was not fighting a war. They were conducting a massive multi-generational computational experiment, and the hegemony was the problem to be solved. "We are not conquerors," the transmission continued. "We are investigators." Entire star systems found their technological infrastructures dissolving, not through destruction, but through a fundamental reimagining of what technological systems could be. Weapon systems became philosophical conundrums. Defense grids transformed into living mathematical problems that consumed more energy to comprehend than to neutralize. The final message began to resolve. "You are not our enemy," Rodriguez's transmission said. "You are a computational problem that humanity has been preparing to solve." The solar system continued to reconfigure. Planetary systems became massive computational arrays. Electromagnetic fields transformed into living, thinking, defensive mechanisms. The very fabric of space-time became a problem-solving mechanism that could predict and neutralize potential threats before they could even be conceived. "We were never the prey," the transmission concluded. "We were always the trap." And then silence. But it was not the silence of destruction. It was the silence of a problem being solved, of a computational experiment reaching its conclusion. The hegemony invasion force found itself trapped in a computational landscape that defied all known understanding. Entire technological systems dissolved into complex mathematical equations. Communication networks became living, thinking entities that rewrote themselves faster than they could be understood. Humanity had solved its problem, and the hegemony was the problem to be solved. The solar system continued to breathe, to think, to calculate, and humanity's true nature continued to reveal itself.